Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Koibu's Corner. This week, I want to talk to you about something different. We were supposed to be talking about how to get the DM on your side, but I got this email from a guy, and it was very well written, and it's kind of the same questions that I've been getting over the years about combat and why I use this system and why I like doing this and how it doesn't quite seem fair in this situation. But he wrote it in a really excellent way that kind of hit all the points on the head very well. And so I'm going to paraphrase what he said and actually take entire paragraphs out of what he said and then read my response back to him and then discuss it, because I think it's a very important thing. And when coherently discussed, I think you will realize that this is a big deal in D&D. And if you get a chance to actually think about it deeply, you're going to find that it might change the entire way you approach the game, or at least the entire way that you approach combat. So, without further ado, let's just start reading. I think the roleplay solemn combat system is inherently flawed, and this is causing a great deal of imbalance against the party. The two specific pieces of the system I would like to address in this message is the lack of a battle map in important combats and the flawed group initiative system. For one, you've stated in the past that you do not enjoy using a battle map as you think it inhibits player creativity. Simply put, the DM cannot expect players to picture everything going on inside of his head. It's just not a fair expectation, and to punish players for not imagining a scene like you did is unreasonable. For characters like Mr. Varnoosh, who rely heavily on positioning to be effective in combat, the lack of a clear picture of the battlefield is highly detrimental. I would argue that Jen is being forced to be less creative simply because she is not being given the tools to use her character to the highest of his ability. In addition, a lack of a clear battle map heavily diminishes the intended power of offensive casters like the wizard, and to a much lesser extent the cleric. Spellcasting classes are extremely technical based, and I simply do not think they work as written in an abstract system. Spells are given extremely specific values like 30-foot radius for a reason. The spellcaster is supposed to be able to take these numbers to the battle map and apply them in specific areas. When no such surface is given, it becomes extremely difficult for the spellcaster and the DM to correctly interpret the actual in combat effects of the spell. When the DM takes a powerful and large spell like Fireball and says, yeah, from this angle you can only really hit about 2 people, that is very likely ripping off the casting character as a whole. This would also, of course, work against the party when they're fighting against spellcasting characters, but I feel like this gives them a greater ability to be more creative within their positioning in combat. 2. On to my second and thankfully much shorter point, the group initiative system. This is a pretty simple argument to make. I understand the need for group initiative. You don't want to roll initiative of 30 orc soldiers, and no one wants to see you roll initiative for 30 orc soldiers. However, when we're in these situations, I think it would be highly beneficial if initiative was rolled once at the beginning of combat, then from that point onwards, the turns should simply alternate. The current rolling initiative every turn system easily makes one side vastly overpowered against the other. If either side wins initiative at the wrong time, they could basically get 2 turns in a row. This keeps important things like life-saving heals from being cast on dying characters, or allow an enemy 2 turns to flee when they should normally only receive 1. And when one side gets 2 turns in a row, that can quickly turn the tide of a battle before the other side even has time to react. This was especially true in the most recent episode of Solemn, when a group of powerful foes like mounted lancers got to go twice in a row. The result can be absolutely detrimental to the party in an unfair way. I think if you implemented alternating turns when the party is locked in a group initiative system, it would be much less imbalanced in combat scenario. And that's those are his key points, and I read them almost verbatim, and now I'm going to read my response to him. Blah, 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 blah. From my perspective, combat is a big, messy, chaotic thing. No one has perfect information. There's yelling, shouting, screams of the dying, and mayhem. You're being hacked at from all over, and you need to keep your eyes on your enemies so you can avoid whatever's coming at you. During all this, the tides of battle shift all around you. Sometimes the weaker party beats the stronger enemy, sometimes the weaker enemy beats the stronger party. Combat is inherently balanced because it can swing equally far in each direction. There's no inherent favor for or against the party. It's just a system that allows for a great deal of unpredictability. I view combat as less of a numbers and levels game, where for instance a 3rd level party can fight a CR3 monster, but a CR4 monster might kill them, and instead as here's a monster with a myriad of abilities and behaviors. It might be stat-wise weaker than anything you fought before, but because of these non-number features and abilities, petrification gaze, that's an insta-kill, flying spells, incorporeal, only hurt by AoE, surrounded by an army, etc., it's going to be the hardest thing that you've done before. That sort of situation. This places less of an emphasis on combat and more of an emphasis on creative problem solving and intricate role playing, which I feel is the heart of D&D. The alternate emphasis, or the alternative, is to emphasize specific combat. But then you're basically playing a pen and paper FF Tactics or something, in which case we should just use a FF Tactics type game for combat and then roleplay all of the out of combat stuff. That's a legit way of doing things, and it would be sweet if we had a game engine where we could build maps and shit, and the enemies/NPCs were controlled by the DM, but I don't think we have the money to invest in that yet. Although, thinking about it now, it would be sick to run a game like that. As for specific spell radiuses, well, how else would you define it? So, that was his question, or his email, and that was my response. And I wanted to address a few more things. The chaotic nature of combat is... I want you to put yourself in a D&D character's shoes. You know, there's 4 people in your party, and you're fighting against like 7 orcs or whatever, or a couple of orcs and some goblins. And you're in this situation, we're going to be like the fighter up in the front, and we've got all this heavy armor weighing us down. We've got a backpack over our shoulder that's got our torches and our scrolls and maybe like a horn of blasting on the back of it and some rope. We've got weapons strapped all over us. We're sweating. We're breathing heavy. We've got our shield up in front of us and our sword here. There's an orc in front of us. There's 2 goblins coming around the sides of us. We got to keep our eyes on this orc and on these goblins. Otherwise, we're not going to, like, if we're not paying attention, they're going to get a clear opening. Or if I'm not paying attention, I'm going to miss an opening that they create. I'm not really going to be able to look back behind me and take a look at the spellcaster, or even if I could look at the wizard behind me, I don't know what he's casting. I don't know where he's casting it. I shouldn't have that sort of information. As for the wizard, man, they're like, the party's moving around. Like the battle isn't just a stationary line. The fighter is not just standing there with the sword hacking away. There's a dance forward and backwards. We don't talk about it too much, but the fighter might push the orc back with a shield and take a few steps forward and slash, or maybe the orc, runs into him and the fighter gets pushed back against his shield and has to stumble 5 feet or 6 feet backwards. Or maybe the goblin coming around from the side means the fighter actually has to retreat 10 feet this way so that the goblin doesn't come all the way around behind him. Combat is very fluid. We don't discuss it too much, but sometimes I'll say things like, oh, you go to slash at him, but he steps out of the way and you run past him and now you're on the other side of the goblin or on the other side of the orc or whatever. We'll do those little bits of flavor text here and there, but that's because combat is this really chaotic, messy soup. And I really like approaching combat in this way. I like approaching it in the way that in combat, you don't really know what's necessarily going on. And I think that when you have combat that is so unpredictable, where you might actually get beaten by someone significantly weaker than you just because the dice happen to roll that way, it makes the preparation for combat a lot more important. And it makes the role-playing that comes into combat a lot more important. Because if you can maybe role-play yourself into an advantage of combat where you start in a more strategic position, or excuse me, or where by doing this set of role-playing, you start with surprise on the enemy, or perhaps you're fighting something like a basilisk, where they have a gaze attack that can kill you instantly, so you don't want to just go into combat with the basilisk, you want to set a trap for it. And we still need the combat rules because you might break out of the trap, or the trap might not go off, and now you have to resort to your backup plan, which is basilisk isn't trapped and only able to look one direction, but now we all, so as backup we have mirrors for shields, and we're not going to look at them, and then we blindfold ourselves. And so you have preparation on top of preparation on top of preparation, and then combat at the base. And your pre-combat prep is the sort of thing that gets you through, gives you, it dulls those wild swings and kind of makes it go makes it work to your advantage. I really like that sort of approach to combat. As I said before, if we wanted to do combat where the party is able to make the perfect decision and has all the tactical information that they need, we should build a video game engine, play out all the combat through the video game engine, and then just do the role playing outside of that. You might as well play Final Fantasy Tactics and just have the DM make up the new storyline, and then you just play the different battles through it, right? Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. Oh, and the thing he mentioned in the first section, or maybe it was the second section, something about, let me find it right here, something about the light spell, something about how the spell mentions like light has a 30-foot radius, or fireball has like a specific 30-foot radius. Well, how else are you going to describe it? Like, oh yeah, this spell will fill a room with light, and that's not very, that's so broad it doesn't make too much sense. Rooms can be 5 by 5 by 5, or they can be 100 by 100 by 10, or 100 by 100 by 50, or 150 by 30 by 7, or whatever. You kind of need specific things for spells, otherwise you have these abstract notions that don't even make sense. Unless you go everything completely abstract, but then you have a system like Dungeon World, which is wildly fantastic, and I love entirely. Anyway, the point of all of this is to try and get you to think about combat a little bit differently, and to get you to think about combat not as a simulator, not as a strategic sort of... I don't want my players to approach combat like a video game, where you can be highly skilled at combat and use because highly skilled is a very poor way of phrasing it. It shouldn't be like a game of StarCraft, where you can min-max your combat to be perfectly efficient. Your combat should be made more efficient or made better by the preparation you put in ahead of time. You shouldn't be able to just walk into any battle and rely on your skills in combat for that. There's more to combat in D&D than just hacking and slashing. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get at here. The asymmetrical nature of combat is what we should be embracing. You have a pen and paper system, and the strength of that is that you have the people to interpret how things go. You can't play Final Fantasy Tactics or Dragon Age and all of a sudden push a whole bunch of rocks down on top of an enemy. But you can do that in D&D. So that should be where, when we're playing pen and paper games like D&D, you should focus. You should be focusing on the strengths of the game system. And the strengths here are creativity and thinking outside the box and breaking the status quo, or going against what you think would be the only way of doing things. That's the heart of pen and paper D&D. Like, it's that creative problem solving and that like really deep role playing, which is the heart of the game. Combat is a section of the game. It's a sub facet of the game. It's thrown in there because it's exciting, but you don't want to treat it as a combat simulator, because it's a very poor combat simulator. We might Punch-Out for the NES, or Super Punch-Out for the SNES, is a much better combat simulator than D&D ever is, and those games are ancient. So that is my piece on combat, or the philosophies of combat. And I hope this has been very helpful for you to understand at least how I approach combat. And I hope you agree with me, or at least see my point here, because we can make D&D better. We can have more fun with the game when we approach the game's strengths and play to the game's strengths, the game system strengths. You know what I mean? I know what you mean. I know that you know what I mean. Anyway, I hope you guys all had a fantastic Thanksgiving. For those of you in the United States, for those of you in Canada, your Thanksgiving is way too early. And for those of you in the rest of the world, I hope you have whatever happy harvest festival feast that you should have at this time of year. And if you don't have a harvest festival where you stuff your face full of food in late October or sometime in November, or maybe even early December, aside from Christmas, you need to get your shit together, guys. Harvest festivals are the shit. Pumpkin pies are delicious. All right, that's it for me. I will see you guys next week for when we actually talk about how to get the DM on your side. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.